Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's October 23rd, and we have a lot to talk about. We're 2 weeks away from an event that's going to have an impact on every person in the United States who's living with MS or any other chronic illness. It's going to have an impact on every family in the United States who are affected by MS or any chronic illness, because in 2 weeks' time, on November the 6th, an election's taking place and healthcare is on the ballot. Maybe not directly, maybe not explicitly, but make no mistake. The choices that voters in America make on Election Day are going to have a huge effect on our access to health care, the cost of health care, and the protections that exist today for people living with pre-existing conditions. If you're a regular listener, then you know how important I think it is for people to speak out, to advocate, and most importantly, to vote on behalf of their own interests. Now, 99.9% of you weren't listening when I launched the first episode of Real Talk MS in September 2017. But even then, I explained that I actually moved up the launch date of the podcast because there was an important vote coming up that week in Congress. It became a historic vote in the Senate that failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So the idea that words have power and that our voice matters has been a part of what this podcast is all about from the very beginning. So this year, in this election, I wanted to make it easy for everyone affected by MS to actually see whether their current legislators in Congress, their members of the House and the Senate, had supported them. So I created the MS Congressional Report Card. I designed an algorithm that looked at all the ways that a member of Congress could have supported people living with MS, and based upon what they did or didn't do, it assigned them a letter grade. And over the past 2 years, the period of time that the algorithm took into consideration, well, there have been dozens of opportunities for a member of Congress to support people living with multiple sclerosis. They could have chosen to join the MS caucus. They could have taken a leadership role in moving important legislation forward. They may have signed on to letters to their colleagues urging them to support specific bills that offered benefit or legal protections to people affected by MS. And of course, they could have voted for the bills that would have a positive impact on individuals and families affected by MS. The algorithm looked at all of this activity, all of these opportunities, and it gave out either an A, a B, a C, D, or an F. And just so you know, in order to earn an F, it meant that someone didn't take a single action, didn't do even one thing to support the MS community. I think this is important information to take with you when you cast your vote on November 6th. So I've made it easy for you to check out your own members of Congress and see their MS Congressional Report Card. Just visit the Real Talk MS website at realtalkms.com and click on MS Congressional Report Card in the menu at the top of the page. Then you'll select the state that you live in, and you'll see exactly how well your representatives and senators have supported you. And then, with that knowledge in hand, you can cast your vote. The one thing I'll ask you to keep in mind is that the MS Congressional Report Card could only issue grades to sitting members of Congress. The candidates who are on the ballot challenging these members of Congress, well, they haven't been in position to do anything yet, so they obviously don't have anything to grade. But as they're elected and they take their seats in Congress, they'll already know that we're going to be watching and voting. And that brings me around to reminding you again that the most vital and impactful form of activism that you can participate in is voting. So please, please, please cast your vote on November the 6th. And I know that casting your vote isn't always easy. Being able to access your polling place can be more challenging than it should be. And having access to your polling place and being able to exercise your right to vote, well, it's so important that it's actually written into the Americans with Disabilities Act. By law, polling places must be accessible. And my guest today on the podcast is MS activist Karen Jackson. Karen and I are going to talk about voting accessibility. But before we get to my conversation with Karen, there are a few other things that you should know about. A couple of weeks ago, while I was at Ekstrom's, I told you about a new documentary that I'm very proud to have been a part of. It's called Seeing MS from the Inside Out. The film was produced by EMD Serrano and executive produced by Shift.ms. And it focuses on 3 different stories that really represent 3 different sides of multiple sclerosis. It tells the story of a woman living with MS in Argentina, a neurologist in Naples, Italy, who treats people living with MS, and a man in the United States whose wife has progressive MS and he serves as her caregiver. Well, that caregiver is me, and I was fortunate enough to be able to share my story as part of this documentary. And I'll be honest with you and let you know that sharing my story wasn't easy. Talking to a friend, I described the experience as reliving some of the saddest moments of my life. But I think this documentary can do so much good for so many people that it was important to me that I participate fully and share some of the hardest parts that I faced and some things that I continue to face being a caregiver. I want you to see the documentary, so you'll find a link to it in today's show notes. And I'm not going to ruin it for you. There aren't any spoilers here, but I will tell you that this film takes a very unique approach to telling these 3 stories. It's something that I'm sure you haven't seen before, and I'm just incredibly honored to be a part of the project. If you've already downloaded the RealTalk MS app from the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, you'll find the film's trailer as part of the bonus content that's only accessible in the RealTalk MS app. But I'll also tell you that the trailer doesn't give away the approach or the angle that this film uses to tell these 3 stories. So you're going to have to watch a documentary to see exactly what they've done and how they've done it. And then I'd love to get your feedback. So please shoot me an email at John, that's Jon, at realtalkms.com, or you can private message me on Twitter and let me know what you think of Seeing MS from the Inside Out. This past Friday, I had an opportunity to watch a film at an event at EMD Serrano's headquarters just outside of Boston. And it was really a special treat for me to experience a documentary with so many people from EMD Serrano. I was with Lydia Emily, a very special artist who's also featured in the documentary. And after Friday's screening, we were able to answer questions and talk with so many people from EMD Serrano who really embody the commitment to helping people living with MS live their very best lives. So thank you again, EMD Serrano, for hosting us, making us feel so welcome, and most especially for all that you do for the MS community every day. Lately, we've talked a lot about something called neurofilament light chain, acting as a predictor of disease activity in relapsing remitting MS. Now, just as a reminder, neurofilament light chain is a protein, and evidence shows that the levels of neurofilament light chain are increased in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid of people living with multiple sclerosis. Neurofilament light chain is usually only found in nerve cells, but as MS causes the progressive degeneration of these nerve cells, well, neurofilament light chain is released into the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. So the idea that neurofilament light chain can serve as a biomarker or a reliable biological predictor for MS progression is an idea that continues to generate interest in the research community. Most of the neurofilament light chain research that's been done has focused on relapsing remitting MS. There really isn't much that's been written about neurofilament light chain levels in people living with progressive MS. Well, a research team from Switzerland has presented a study that indicates that measuring the level of neurofilament light chain may predict brain atrophy in people living with primary progressive MS and secondary progressive MS. This study was done in conjunction with the phase 3 clinical trials for Gilenya in people living with primary progressive MS and Siponimod in people living with secondary progressive MS. A total of 376 people with primary progressive MS and 1,452 people with secondary progressive MS participated in the study. And the study showed that higher levels of neurofilament light chain were associated with higher disease activity, and higher levels of neurofilament light chain were also associated with greater future brain atrophy, demonstrating that neurofilament light chain levels can be a reliable predictor of brain atrophy and future disability progression in people living with progressive MS. If you're interested in the details of this study, I'll include a link in today's show notes. Let's make neuroplasticity the RealTalk MS vocabulary word for the day. It refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections. Neuroplasticity allows the neurons or the nerve cells in the brain to compensate for injury or disease and to adjust their activities in response to new situations or changes in their environment. And we're talking about neuroplasticity today because a team of researchers from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the State University of New York at Buffalo, and co-author Dr. John DeLuca of the Kessler Foundation, they've proposed a conceptual framework for examining the relationship between exercise and adaptive neuroplasticity among people living with MS. We're hearing more and more about studies that demonstrate that exercise can improve mobility or cognition for people living with MS, but researchers haven't yet focused on how this is happening. What are the neural mechanisms that are being created to produce these improvements? Well, this proposed conceptual framework will allow researchers to begin to look for answers to that question. It will enable scientists to systematically examine the effects of exercise on brain connectivity, brain structure, and cellular mechanisms among people living with MS, and gaining this level of understanding can lead to the development of new MS rehabilitation strategies. When you think about improving mobility or cognition, exercise represents a low-cost, easily accessed treatment. This proposed framework integrates neuroscience, neurophysiology, and neurorehabilitation in an effort to accelerate advances in incorporating exercise as part of a long-term MS symptom management plan. Nationwide voter participation among people living with disabilities has been declining. And I found that to be particularly worrisome as healthcare has become so politicized that everyone needs to vote, especially anyone living with a chronic illness or disability, because they have the most to gain or to lose if our healthcare laws are changed. So I wanted to talk with someone who's been on the front lines when it comes to ensuring access to voting. And in a moment, you'll hear my conversation with MS activist Karen Jackson. Karen Jackson is an MS activist living with primary progressive MS, and we're talking about the importance of voting and the challenges that can sometimes go along with gaining access to vote. Welcome to the podcast, Karen.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking me to participate, John.
Well, sure. So let's start with this. Voter participation among people with disabilities has actually declined over the past two presidential elections. So as a fellow MS activist, why is it important for people living with MS to vote in the upcoming midterm election?
Just because of your opening statement of the decline, we need to have the disability community know that places, especially where I live in the state of Virginia, they're making major strides to make it barrier-free. And it is our way to raise our voice and have our voices heard, especially in our community. The disability community is the largest minority in the entire world. And so I just think it's our right and our privilege, and it shouldn't be taken lightly or taken for granted.
You know, some people aren't aware, but access to polling places is actually part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's technically the law, but the reality can be a little different. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office published a really interesting study that showed that of the 137 polling places that they inspected on Election Day in 2016, 2/3 of them had at least one physical impediment barrier to people with disabilities. And what's really alarming is that this number is going in the wrong direction. In 2008, less than half the polling places that were inspected on Election Day had at least one barrier to people with disabilities. So the trend is not going the way it should be. At the same time, I mean, I'd love for you to comment on that. I know you had a pretty extraordinary voting experience in 2016. We can talk about that too.
Yeah, in the state of Virginia, I live in Northern Virginia, and they've made, like I said, major strides to make it barrier-free. They've addressed, we have curbside voting, for instance. We also have, they made it accessible for the hearing impaired or for the visually impaired. They've really tried. We're not perfect, but we're getting there. And my experience in 2016 was pretty cool. A woman wanted to vote and had no way to get to the polls. She wanted to vote in person. She did not want to do absentee voting, and she didn't want to do it online. She wanted to physically go to the polling places. So a call was put out to find somebody, she was in a wheelchair, to find somebody that could provide transportation. I have a wheelchair accessible van. I use hand controls to drive myself, but the van can be driven by regular everyday folks. So I offered to allow somebody to borrow my van if they were comfortable driving, to take this woman to the polls. And as it turned out, there was a woman that was driving all over the state, even Maryland. She was going to the tri-state area, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, to vote, to allow people to vote. And when she got to my home, I said, "Are you comfortable getting somebody in and out of my van using the ramp?" And she really wasn't. So I knew where this woman lived that wanted to get to the polls, and I just said, "I'll drive you over to her home, and then I'll ride my wheelchair home." And when we got there, we took a few lessons to get her into my van. We did that, and it was incredibly successful. She didn't take that long before I could get home, driving back in my wheelchair to my home. The woman that drove her was calling me to say, I'm at your home and looking for you." I said, "I'm riding down the street right now." So that was an incredibly positive experience for everybody. Sometimes you just have to trust your gut, and because allowing somebody to use your van and know that, God forbid, there'd be an accident or damage to the van. But like I said, you trust your gut. Sometimes you just have to go with it and know that it's going to be okay and you're doing the right thing. So that was a just great all-around experience.
Well, that was incredibly generous of you too. So thank you for being so kind and generous. I know that sometimes the problem is getting to the polling place, and you solve that for someone. As you mentioned, there's always the option of voting by mail, which eliminates a lot of the physical impediments that can stand in the way. But for people who do want to vote, there are such seemingly simple things that poll workers don't always think about. but they need to. For instance, if you're voting in a school or a church or a library, there may be a couple of steps that lead up to the door to get into that facility. And it's up to the poll workers to have a ramp available. Sometimes they don't realize that's their responsibility. The U.S. Justice Department has actually published a polling place checklist to be sure that the polling place is ADA compliant. As a matter of fact, if people listening have already downloaded the RealTalk MS app, I'm going to include a PDF copy of the ADA polling place checklist under the bonus content tab. So that's something you can actually take with you when you go to vote on November 6th. As I said, it's a U.S. Department of Justice publication, and you can easily point out to any of the poll workers exactly what their legal responsibility is to ensure that you can cast your ballot. And if you haven't downloaded the RealTalk MS app, you can always find it at the Apple App Store for your iOS device or the Google Play Store for your Android device. Getting back to what people might find themselves up against, what are some of the things that people can do to ensure that they can cast their vote with relative ease on November 6th? What do you recommend, Karen?
Well, where I am, again, if they go on to not only the state website for elections, go to Fairfax County, and the folks that live in Fairfax County can go to a website, and it will give you information on how to voting at the polls on election day. In the state of Virginia, it is, again, as you said, all polling places are wheelchair accessible. At least that's what is stated. That's not always what is true. So I'd recommend, if they have a caregiver or a family member or a friend, go check out the polling place possibly before the day of voting, or they can also check and see if they have early voting availability. And if they have early voting and somebody can go and again check on the polling place itself, they can find out for sure whether it is accessible that day, or they can do early voting. I also really strongly suggest going on to any websites that you have access to in your state. I know there's an issue, I think, I could be corrected, I think about 2 years ago in the state of Pennsylvania, and specifically in Pittsburgh. And it was about a voting in a polling place that was not accessible, that was stated to be accessible, but the day of it was not. So anything we can do ahead of time, you can make phone calls to your local polling place, you can make phone calls to your state election board. There's many ways that we can find out ahead of time so that we're not caught the day of. Also in the state of Virginia, you have until, if voting is on Tuesday, you have until Friday, if you come to the polling places in Virginia, as of, I believe it was July 2014, they require photo ID. And so obviously you need to check on that also in your state if you need a photo ID and what the requirements are, and make sure that you can meet those requirements. Here, if you show up to vote and you don't have your photo ID, you can cast a provisional ballot, and that ballot will remain until noon the Friday after the election to present photo ID. So there's many little things that we can do ahead of time to check and find out if we've met the requirements and what our barriers will be.
I really think that is some really important and very useful advice. Actually earlier, Karen and I were talking about how traveling when you're living with MS simply requires some advanced planning, and that can make all the difference. Well, in this case, I want you to imagine that we're going to all be taking a trip to a place called the polling place on November the 6th. And unfortunately, we don't always know exactly what that's going to be like. So the more advanced planning you can do by checking it out, by making some phone calls, by going online, a little bit of advanced work will mean on election day, you're going to have a far easier time traveling through the land of cast your vote than you otherwise might. Well, we've been talking with MS activist Karen Jackson. Karen, thank you for all of your work as an advocate for people living with multiple sclerosis, and thanks for talking with me today.
John, thank you for the opportunity. I sincerely appreciate it and hope everybody does get out and vote to let your voice be heard.
Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Don't forget to visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or device. It's the easiest way for you to connect to the podcast, and it's a great way for me to share all kinds of bonus content with you. And I hope you take a moment over the next 2 weeks to visit realtalkms.com and check the MS Congressional Report Card for your elected representatives in Washington. Check their grades and make sure that they're acting on your behalf. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.